By 1900, John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of America's oil refining and 80% of the world's oil market, making Standard Oil the largest corporation on Earth. This wasn't just another monopoly story, though, because what Rockefeller built went far beyond market dominance. He constructed infrastructure that made oil unavoidable, engineered dependency into the system itself, and in doing so transformed a commodity that barely existed in 1860 into something more strategically important than gold, steel, or even food by 1920. The question nobody asks is this: how did kerosene for lamps become the fuel that determined which nations won wars? The answer lies in three calculated pivots that changed everything. First, Rockefeller turned kerosene into a universal consumer product and created mass dependency. Then he built unavoidable infrastructure through vertical integration while controlling every choke point in the supply chain. And finally, oil transitioned from lighting fuel to industrial and military power, becoming a geopolitical weapon. Lord Curzon, the British Foreign Secretary, declared after World War I that the Allies floated to victory on a wave of oil, and that statement captured how completely the transformation had occurred. Oil went from lighting lamps to determining the fate of empires, and Rockefeller didn't predict this transformation. He architected it. Understanding what Rockefeller built requires seeing what existed before him, starting with 1859 when Colonel Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Chaos erupted within months as thousands of speculators swarmed the region, drilling wherever they could sink a hole, and the Civil War drove oil prices from 35 cents a barrel in 1862 to $13 and 75 cents at the peak. Fortunes appeared overnight and vanished just as quickly. The barriers to entry were laughably low, since $1,000 bought you basic refining equipment, and a few men could operate a small refinery. So everyone tried. They would blow holes in the ground and gather up the oil as they could, often leading to creeks and rivers flowing with wasted oil in the place of water, turning entire waterways black with petroleum. Refining capacity exploded between 1865 and 1870, and the ratio of refining capacity to actual oil production reached 2.5 to 1, meaning far too many refiners were chasing too little crude. Kerosene prices collapsed from 58 cents per gallon in 1865 to 26 cents by 1870, and the industry hemorrhaged money. The economics weren't even the worst problem, though, because product quality was abysmal and impure kerosene could be highly explosive. 5,000 to 6,000 people died every year from kerosene-related accidents, lamps would explode without warning, and homes would burn, so the refining industry was quite literally killing its own customers. Whale oil was depleted meanwhile, with the great whales hunted nearly to extinction and chased from Antarctica to Alaska by New England whalers desperate for blubber to boil into lamp oil. Coal-derived kerosene existed, but the extraction process was tedious and expensive, which meant only the wealthy could afford decent lighting, and most Americans went to bed when the sun set. The market potential was enormous, with China alone having 400 million potential customers, but the industry was destroying itself through waste, inconsistency, and chaos. What it needed was order, system. Someone who understood that the path to dominance wasn't finding more oil, but organizing the refining process. John D. Rockefeller entered the refining business in 1863 at age 24, and two things about the oil industry bothered him from the start: the appalling waste and the wildly fluctuating prices. Most people saw these as temporary problems, but Rockefeller recognized them as structural, understanding this wasn't a crisis that would pass, but an industry that would continue cannibalizing itself unless someone imposed discipline. His insight was simple, but profound in that the winners wouldn't be the best drillers, but the most systematic refiners. So he made a calculated decision to focus on refining rather than drilling, on system rather than speculation. He later said, "They saw the vast possibilities of the oil industry. stood at the center of it, and brought their knowledge and imagination and business experience to bear in a dozen, in 20, in 30 directions. Rockefeller's first move was brutally simple: eliminate waste, and while competitors dumped 40% of each barrel of crude oil as useless residue, Rockefeller saw 40% more profit. Gasoline powered his refinery machinery. The rest sold as lubricating oils, paraffin wax, and petroleum jelly, and he even used the tar for paving roads. Standard Oil eventually developed 300 products from each barrel of crude oil, which meant competitors were throwing away nearly half their potential revenue. Quality standardization came next, and there's a reason he named his company Standard Oil, since the spotty quality of American kerosene had inspired the name. Rockefeller implemented precise temperature controls in the distillation process and hired chemists who developed a method to produce kerosene using 1/5 the sulfuric acid that competitors required. The result was consistent, safe product that didn't explode in people's homes. And this wasn't altruism, but market strategy, since reliable kerosene meant repeat customers and growing market share. Relentless cost-cutting followed, starting with fire insurance premiums in the refining industry that ranged from 5 to 25% of a facility's value. Rockefeller looked at this expense and thought, why pay someone else? So he created his own self-insurance fund while setting aside money regularly to handle fire damage and implementing every safety precaution his engineers could devise. The practice saved thousands of dollars annually and eventually millions, with these insurance funds growing large enough over time to pay substantial dividends to shareholders. Rockefeller understood something his competitors didn't, though, which was that controlling refining wasn't enough, because you had to control the inputs and the logistics. He bought white oak forests to supply lumber for barrels, built kilns on site to dry the wood while saving on shipping weight, employed his own coopers and cut barrel costs from $2.50 to 96 cents, then hired his own plumbers and halved the cost of pipes and plumbing. Materials. Cleveland as his strategic location was no accident, since the city had access to the Erie Canal plus 2 competing railroad lines, meaning lower transportation costs and more competitive prices. Rockefeller leveraged this advantage ruthlessly. The landmark deal came in 1868 when he negotiated with the Lakeshore Railroad, and Standard Oil would ship at least 60 carloads of oil daily while handling all loading and unloading itself. The railroad offered a 71% discount in return, dropping the rate from $1.48 per barrel to 42 cents, and critics called this corruption, but it was simply volume economics. Standard could guarantee massive, consistent shipments. The railroad saved money on labor and logistics. Both parties benefited, and smaller refiners couldn't match this deal because they didn't have equivalent volume to offer. Rockefeller was refining oil more efficiently than anyone in the world by 1870, but he saw the next choke point: transportation infrastructure, and railroads had too much leverage. In 1877, he told them directly that pipelines were the alternative, and the Pennsylvania Railroad responded by forming a subsidiary to buy and build oil refineries and pipelines, trying to compete directly with Standard Oil. Rockefeller didn't flinch, but held back shipments, enlisted other railroads, and started a price war that dramatically reduced freight payments and caused labor unrest for the Pennsylvania Railroad. When the dust settled, the railroad sold all its oil interests to Standard Oil, and by 1882, Standard controlled 4,000 miles of pipeline, meaning the railroads no longer had leverage. The economic results devastated competitors, since in 1870, Rockefeller sold kerosene for 26 cents per gallon. By 1880, it was 9 cents per gallon, and by 1890, 7 cents per gallon. That's an 80% price reduction over 20 years, and yet Standard Oil's profit margins kept expanding while output quadrupled between 1870 and 1880 despite prices collapsing. Competitors faced impossible economics because they couldn't match Standard's efficiency, couldn't match Standard's scale, couldn't match Standard's costs, and one by one, they failed or sold out. January 2nd, 1882, changed everything when Rockefeller formalized his empire and 41 investors signed the Standard Oil Trust Agreement, pooling their securities from 40 companies into a single holding agency managed by 9 trustees. The initial value was $70 million, and at formation, the Standard Oil Trust produced most of the world's kerosene, owned 4,000 miles of pipeline, and employed 100,000 workers. This wasn't just a company, but the first modern corporation of corporations. Getting to that point required what came to be known as the Cleveland Massacre, and in 1872 alone, Standard Oil bought out or destroyed 75% of Cleveland's refiners. The strategy was straightforward in that Rockefeller would offer a buyout at what he considered a fair price. And if the owner accepted, fine. But if not, Standard would engage in predatory pricing until the competitor collapsed. Most accepted the buyout, while the holdouts were crushed. Rockefeller controlled the oil markets of Cleveland, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, West Virginia, and Baltimore by 1877. And by 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of U.S. refining capacity. Horizontal dominance was complete. Horizontal dominance wasn't enough, though, because Rockefeller understood that real power came from vertical integration, which meant controlling every stage of production from the oil well to the consumer's lamp. Upstream, he acquired oil wells in Ohio even though production was never his primary focus. Midstream, he dominated transportation through pipelines and tank cars, and he even created a futures market by issuing certificates against oil stored in Standard's pipelines. Downstream was where the real transformation happened since Rockefeller revolutionized distribution by introducing tank wagons, and these eliminated wholesale jobbers. The middlemen who had been adding 3 to 5 cents per gallon to the price, while often diluting Standard's kerosene with inferior product from independent refiners. Standard Oil divided the United States into 11 districts where tank wagons delivered refined oil to storage tanks, then set out for local groceries and hardware stores to replenish special canisters that Standard provided. Sometimes, over the furious opposition of storekeepers, tank wagons even went door to door while selling directly to households, putting Standard Oil in the retail trade. The requirements for Standard station managers were explicit: command at least 85% of the local oil trade. And managers understood they would spy on other distributors to ensure they weren't selling competitors' oil. Retailers who didn't comply and sell only Standard kerosene faced 2 options. Rockefeller would sell door-to-door to undercut them, or open a competing general store to drive them out of business entirely. Standard created consumer dependency through hardware meanwhile, and the company sold or gave away millions of kerosene lamps, stoves, and heaters, often at cost or below cost. The goal wasn't profit on the hardware, but creating a consumer base locked into Standard's fuel. And once a family owned a Standard-designed lamp optimized for Standard's kerosene viscosity, switching to a competitor's product became inconvenient. Systematic predatory pricing was another tactic, with Standard Oil charging unprofitably low prices in 9,000 of the 37,000 towns where tank wagons distributed oil. The company would sell below cost to drive out local competition. Then, once Standard dominated a market, prices would rise to recover the losses. And Standard even created phantom companies that appeared independent but were secretly owned by the trust, giving consumers the illusion of choice. The strategic genius here wasn't about the oil itself, since Rockefeller understood that controlling the system mattered more than controlling the product. Competitors could find oil, refine oil, even make better oil, but they couldn't transport it as cheaply because Standard owned the pipelines and had the railroad deals, couldn't distribute it as widely because Standard owned the tank wagon networks and the retail relationships, couldn't market it as effectively because Standard had already given away the lamps, and couldn't maintain consistency because Standard had spent decades perfecting quality standards. An industry historian later observed that the orderly, economic, efficient flow is what we now call vertical integration, and he didn't know whether Rockefeller ever used the word integration, only that he conceived the idea. Any new refiner faced structurally impossible economics by 1882 since they had to negotiate higher railroad rates because they lacked volume, had to build distribution networks from scratch because Standard owned the retail relationships, had to educate consumers about their product because Standard had already done this work, and had to compete on price, which was suicide given Standard's scale advantages. Market entry became not just expensive, but structurally impossible, and what economists now call a network effect trap had been created. The more people used Standard Oil, the more infrastructure Standard built, and the more infrastructure Standard built, the more people used Standard Oil. So competitors weren't just facing a big company, but an entire system designed to exclude them. Dominating America wasn't enough, so in 1882, Rockefeller sent William Herbert Libby to survey Far East markets where the potential was staggering. China had 400 million people, and Japan, India, Southeast Asia represented hundreds of millions more. But there was a problem in that these populations didn't use oil, had no habit of petroleum consumption, no infrastructure, no knowledge of how to use kerosene lamps. Most businesses would have seen this as a barrier, but Rockefeller saw it as an opportunity since if there was no existing market, he would create one. The result was the Mei-Fu campaign. And Mei-Fu meant beautiful confidence in Chinese while becoming the brand name for Standard Oil in China and the name of the inexpensive tin lamps that Standard distributed. Over the next decade, Standard Oil gave away or sold at near cost over 8 million kerosene lamps across China, Japan, and India, and the company translated pamphlets into Chinese promoting the safety of kerosene lighting. Standard agents traveled deep into China's interior while teaching people how to fill lamps, trim wicks, and use kerosene safely. And sampans laden with Standard Oil products floated up rivers into remote villages. Rockefeller later wrote that in many countries they had to teach the people to burn oil by making lamps for them, pack the oil to be carried by camels or on the backs of runners in the most remote portions of the world, and adapted the trade to the needs of strange folk. This wasn't charity but infrastructure building since Standard was creating not just customers, but entire markets dependent on a product those customers hadn't known existed 5 years earlier. The company sold hundreds of thousands of cheap lamps and wicks, while sometimes distributing them free with the first kerosene purchase. And once a household owned a Mei-Fu lamp, they needed Mei-Fu kerosene, because switching costs had been manufactured. Standard adapted to each local market, with Europeans wanting to buy kerosene in small quantities. So Standard supplied tank wagons that sold oil street by street. In tropical climates, the company adjusted kerosene formulations to prevent evaporation, and for remote regions without roads, Standard packed oil for camel transport, meaning the company didn't just export a product, but exported an entire system of consumption. Standard faced serious global competition by the 1890s since the Russian port of Baku on the Caspian Sea emerged as a major oil center. The Naval brothers built refineries, pipelines, and the world's first oil tanker to exploit Russian crude. The Rothschilds provided financing, and additional fields were discovered in Burma and Java, while Royal Dutch Shell entered Asian markets aggressively. Rockefeller responded with predatory international pricing, and Standard Oil often kept foreign prices depressed, subsidized by higher prices to American consumers to maintain market share in Asian and European countries. In the 1870s, Standard was providing free kerosene lamps to remote parts of the world while teaching foreigners to use them in order to build a global consumer base, and the strategy was to lose money initially to create long-term dependency. The key advantage wasn't just American oil production, but that Standard had already built the distribution infrastructure, so competitors had oil but lacked the systematic last-mile delivery networks. They had product, but consumers already owned Standard-designed lamps, and switching required not just finding a new supplier, but replacing hardware, retraining on usage, and often accepting lower quality. Standard Oil controlled approximately 80% of the global refined product market by 1900, and the company's infrastructure spanned North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Removing Standard Oil would have collapsed the global lighting infrastructure, since oil wasn't just a product anymore, but the foundation of modern illumination worldwide. Everything changed in the 1880s when Thomas Edison's light bulb began eroding kerosene's dominance, and electric lighting was cleaner, safer, and more convenient, while Pennsylvania's oil fields were depleting. Many observers predicted Standard Oil's decline, since the company's main product was becoming obsolete. Rockefeller had built something more durable than a kerosene monopoly, though, because he had built a petroleum infrastructure that could adapt. Gasoline, which had previously been discarded as a useless waste product, suddenly became valuable when Carl Benz built the first gasoline-powered automobile in 1886, and in 1908, Henry Ford's Model T began rolling off assembly lines. 8.5 million automobiles were registered in the United States by 1920. 1919 marked the first time gasoline sales exceeded kerosene sales, and Standard's waste product had become its primary revenue source. The infrastructure didn't need to change, since the refineries, pipelines, distribution networks all remained, and only the end use transformed. Oil's industrial applications multiplied meanwhile, with lubricating oils becoming essential for factory machinery, petroleum-based chemicals enabling new manufacturing processes, and paraffin, asphalt, and dozens of petroleum derivatives finding commercial uses. The most strategic transformation was happening in the military sphere, though. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, made a momentous decision in 1911 when he pushed the British Royal Navy to convert from coal-fired boilers to oil-burning engines. This wasn't primarily about efficiency, even though oil had double the thermal content of coal, but about strategic advantage. Coal-fired battleships had fatal vulnerabilities, since they burned 10 tons of coal per hour, while producing dense black smoke visible from dozens of miles away. And this smoke was a beacon announcing a fleet's position to any enemy submarine or ship. Refueling required laborers to shovel coal manually in a slow and dangerous process, and ships needed frequent visits to coaling stations strategically placed around the globe. Oil changed everything because it burned cleaner, hotter, and without telltale smoke, ships could travel farther on the same volume of fuel. Refueling was faster and required fewer crew, and range doubled. The U.S. Navy followed Britain's lead, and the Texas, commissioned in 1914 with coal-fired boilers, converted to fuel oil in 1925, while becoming the last American battleship to make the transition. 100% of naval vessels worldwide and 85% of merchant ships burned oil for propulsion by 1939. Oil's strategic importance fully revealed itself during World War I, though, and when the war began in August 1914, military logistics were still based on horses and railways. There was actually a worldwide oil glut, because petroleum had few uses beyond making kerosene for lighting, and the Ford Model T had only been in production for 6 years, so nobody anticipated what was coming. Everything mechanized over the course of the war, and the British Army entered the war with 250 airplanes, 827 motor cars, and 15 motorcycles. By November 1918, they had 55,000 airplanes, 56,000 trucks, 23,000 motor cars, and 34,000 motorcycles, while horses gave way to tanks, cannons became mobile artillery, and aircraft evolved from reconnaissance tools to bombers. Germany, relying on coal-powered railways and horse-drawn supply lines, couldn't match Allied mobility, since the Allies controlled more than 70% of worldwide petroleum production. 80% of Allied oil came from the United States and was protected by the U.S. Navy during transport to Europe, and German forces became progressively immobilized as their limited fuel supplies dwindled. Cutting off German access to Romanian oil fields proved to be a turning point in 1918, and by the time Germany surrendered on November 11th, its army possessed only a few days' worth of fuel. French economist Francis de Lacy concluded that the victory of 1918 was simply the triumph of the Allied truck over the German railway, the first being driven by fuel and combustion engines, the second by coal. British Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon declared at the first post-war session of the Inter-Allied Petroleum Conference on November 23, 1918, that the Allies floated to victory on a wave of oil. Oil had transformed from a consumer lighting product into the most critical military resource on Earth, and whoever controlled oil supplies could determine the outcome of wars. Energy had become a geopolitical weapon. Understanding why oil became unavoidable requires understanding the three layers of lock-in that Rockefeller created, starting with hardware dependency since Rockefeller had distributed millions of lamps designed for specific kerosene grades. Automobiles emerged and were built around gasoline engines. Naval vessels converted to oil and couldn't revert to coal without completely rebuilding entire fleets, and industrial machinery was designed for petroleum lubricants. Billions of dollars in infrastructure investment had been built around petroleum by the 1920s, including pipelines, refineries, and distribution networks, and replacing this infrastructure would cost more than continuing to use it. Knowledge and skills dependency formed the second layer since Rockefeller's agents had trained entire populations to use kerosene lamps safely. Automotive mechanics were trained exclusively on gasoline engines, naval officers trained in oil-based logistics, and industrial engineers designed around petroleum specifications. Consumer habits formed over decades became cultural norms, and switching would require not just new hardware, but retraining entire populations and industries. The third layer was economic and strategic dependency, where economically, replacing oil infrastructure would cost more than continuing to use it, while strategically, nations without oil access found themselves at a military disadvantage. Temporally, switching would take decades, and competitors couldn't afford to wait, and network effects meant more oil users led to more infrastructure, which led to more new users. Standard Oil's real monopoly wasn't market share, but making oil structurally necessary. And after Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, competitors could and did enter the oil market. They entered a market where oil was already unavoidable, though, because Rockefeller had created the category, not just the dominant company within it. The geopolitical transformation was complete since before 1900. Strategic resources were gold, silver, agricultural land, and coal. But after 1920, oil dominated everything. Oil determined naval power, and Britain's empire became dependent on Middle East oil access. Oil determined land warfare capability, and mechanized armies could overrun horse-drawn forces. Oil determined air power, and every aircraft required refined petroleum. And oil determined industrial capacity, since factories needed lubricants, chemicals, and power. There's an irreversibility principle here where once infrastructure is built, reversal becomes economically impossible. Britain's 1911 decision to convert its navy to oil created permanent dependency on Middle Eastern supply, and this drove British colonial policy in Mesopotamia and Persia, made oil supply lines a national security priority, and Britain could not undecide without scrapping its entire fleet and rebuilding from scratch. The modern echo of this is everywhere since Rockefeller's model of creating infrastructure that makes your product unavoidable is the playbook for today's tech giants. Microsoft created operating system dependency, Google created search infrastructure dependency, Amazon created logistics infrastructure dependency, and the current energy transition follows the same pattern with electric grids, charging stations, and battery supply chains. Whoever controls the infrastructure controls the industry, and Rockefeller proved it first. President Theodore Roosevelt filed an antitrust suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1906, and the trial lasted years with more than 400 witnesses testifying. The government produced evidence of illegal railroad discounts, blocked pipelines, industrial espionage, and bribery of elected officials. And in 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil dissolved. The company was split into 34 independent entities, and these included Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, which became Mobil, Standard Oil of California, which became Chevron, and Standard Oil of Indiana, which became Amoco. The largest and most powerful corporation in the world had been legally dismantled. Here's the irony, though. Rockefeller owned 25% of the shares in all the successor companies, and when the breakup occurred, share values approximately doubled. He emerged from the dissolution as the richest man in the world, and his personal wealth increased because each company now competed aggressively for market share. The overall oil market expanded faster, driven by World War I demand, and no single company bore the political costs of being a monopoly. There's a deeper victory here, since breaking up Standard Oil didn't break up the oil system, and the infrastructure remained, with the pipelines, distribution networks, and consumer dependency all persisting. The successor companies inherited fully built infrastructure. The market continued growing because oil was already unavoidable by 1911, and Standard's market dominance had actually declined from 90% to 70% due to natural competition. Category dominance remained at 100% though, because oil was essential to civilization. Rockefeller's true achievement wasn't market share, but market creation, since he made oil the most powerful industry by making it necessary. Even his enemies used oil, and Germany and Japan during World War II desperately needed petroleum despite being at war with oil-producing nations, so no alternative system existed because Rockefeller had built the only system. The Standard Oil breakup didn't end oil industry consolidation, but created what became known as the Seven Sisters, and these were Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf, and Texaco from the United States, plus Royal Dutch Shell and BP from Europe. These 7 companies controlled 85% of the world's known oil reserves by the 1960s, and they functioned as a cartel while engaging in price fixing, market division, and production quotas. The Red Line Agreement of 1928 formalized their control over Middle Eastern oil by drawing boundaries across the former Ottoman Empire and dividing the region into spheres of influence. These companies became quasi-governmental actors while negotiating directly with foreign governments, influencing U.S. foreign policy, and securing military protection for their assets. The geopolitical transformation was complete, since oil was no longer just a commodity, but diplomatic currency. And U.S. foreign policy became driven by oil access. President Roosevelt met with Saudi King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud in 1945 and secured what became known as the Oil for Security deal, where America would guarantee Saudi Arabia's security in exchange for reliable oil access. The CIA orchestrated a coup in Iran in 1953 to reverse oil nationalization, and throughout the Cold War, the U.S. supported Gulf monarchies to ensure supply stability. The entire global economy ran on oil by the 1950s, with transportation depending on petroleum, since cars, trucks, ships, and airplanes all burned oil-derived fuels. The chemical industry depended on petroleum, with plastics, pharmaceuticals, and fertilizers all coming from petroleum derivatives. Manufacturing depended on petroleum for lubrication, power, and raw materials, and every modern weapon system was petroleum-dependent. Oil had become the lifeblood of industrial civilization. The 3 strategic moves that transformed oil into the world's most powerful industry are worth revisiting, starting with Move 1, kerosene to universal consumer product, where Rockefeller created a mass market through standardization and price reduction, built consumer dependency by distributing hardware, and made lighting accessible to ordinary people while creating unstoppable demand. Move 2 was infrastructure to unavoidable system, where vertical integration created massive switching costs, network effects made competition structurally impossible, and the distribution system became more valuable than the refineries themselves. Move 3 was industrial and military fuel to geopolitical weapon, where the pivot from kerosene to gasoline and diesel changed everything. Oil became a prerequisite for modern warfare, and energy transformed into a national security priority. Why this matters today is because Rockefeller's model still defines how industries achieve dominance, and infrastructure creates necessity. Modern parallels are everywhere, with cloud computing providers like Oz, Azure, and Google Cloud creating dependency through infrastructure. Smartphone ecosystems from Apple and Android creating switching costs through app libraries and user data, and social networks creating lock-in through network effects. We're witnessing another energy transition right now, with electric vehicles, renewable energy, and battery storage. And the question isn't just what technology will power the future, but who's building the infrastructure that makes alternatives unavoidable. Tesla isn't just making cars since they're building charging networks, building battery factories, and creating the infrastructure that could make electric vehicles unavoidable. The ultimate irony of Rockefeller's story is this. He was accused of monopoly, greed, and ruthlessness. Courts dissolved his company, and journalists attacked him as a robber baron. His actual genius was making oil indispensable, though, and Standard Oil was dissolved. Yet oil's dominance only grew because Rockefeller didn't just corner a market, but created the world's dependency on that market. There's a quote often attributed to Rockefeller that competition is a sin, and the real meaning isn't about eliminating rivals, but about building infrastructure that makes competition irrelevant. Don't compete in existing markets, but create the system that makes your product unavoidable. Oil became the world's most powerful industry because Rockefeller engineered a world that couldn't function without it. And as we debate energy transitions and technological disruptions today, remember this lesson. The question isn't just what powers the future, but who controls the infrastructure that makes that power unavoidable. Rockefeller's lesson endures. Whoever builds the system rules the industry. Subscribe to the Economic Record to understand how strategic infrastructure shapes industries and determines who holds power in capitalism.